Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura.
And I'm Tom.
And this is episode number 24. So today we're talking about the mega network that is Nickelodeon, an American-based series of cable shows and channels for kids.
Nickelodeon. Nickelodeon.
Now, before we get into it, Tom, how much of Nickelodeon was a part of your life growing up? Because as I got into this research, I didn't realize how much it was a part of my life and how much I loved the shows on this channel.
Does I still know the words to Killer Tofu on Doug? Does that count as how much I love Nickelodeon?
Yikes.
No, I used to watch a lot of Nickelodeon. In fact, I think we are both of the age where we watched a lot more Nickelodeon than we ever did of like Disney Channel.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. I think for me, the Disney Channel, I was a little bit too old for the Disney Channel when that really picked up and got popular. So yeah, it was definitely Nickelodeon for me.
Well, we were too old for the Disney Channel when the shows came out. We were not too old for the movies.
True, yes.
You know, I still will watch Brink from time to time.
So, all right, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Our story begins in the 1970s when TV programming for kids was limited to Sesame Street, The Electric Company, and some old cartoons. I remember like the Roadrunner and Elmer Fudd and Tweety. Like I remember all those. I watched those a lot.
Yeah, all the Looney Tunes.
Looney Tunes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, because ABC, I think, used to have the Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner show on Saturday mornings, and then when Cartoon Network came along, they got all the rights to all the Looney Tunes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, that's what basically sustained Cartoon Network for like the first 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Was having the rights to all the Looney Tunes and all the old like Hanna-Barbera cartoons, because they did like the Flintstones. They did, I think, Wacky Races was a Hanna-Barbera. I think Hong Kong Phooey, which in retrospect was incredibly racist. Quick Draw McGraw and all those old cartoons from like the 60s were on Cartoon Network for like the first 5 years of its existence. Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? The original Scooby-Doo.
I have to say, I loved the Flintstones and the Jetsons. Like those were big in my house growing up. Yeah.
I actually had the VCR tape of when the Flintstones met the Jetsons.
Yeah, that was huge. Yeah.
That was like that huge kind of crossovers were a thing in the 2000s. Crossovers were a thing.
Did you take the Flintstones vitamins when you were a kid? Those weird tasting fruity vitamins?
They keep you strong and growing.
They do, but they tasted weird.
I don't think I had the Flintstone vitamins.
You were too good for the Flintstones?
I had vitamins, I just didn't have the Flintstone ones.
Vivian Horner, who worked for PBS on the Electric Company production, recognized a hole in the market at the time, and she left PBS to start her own network. In December of 1977, the first test broadcast aired on a local TV network called QB in Columbus, Ohio. It was a show called Pinwheel, and it was very much like Sesame Street in that it had short skits and songs, as well as a mix of human and puppet characters. A year and a half later, in April of 1979, the Nickelodeon network would be officially launched on Warner Cable. Nickelodeon is a reference to the neighborhood theaters that charged a nickel for admission to the shows in the early 1900s. Vivian didn't love the name, but she did agree to it. Now, the logo wasn't so great either. It spelled out the word Nickelodeon in these like bold black letters with the tagline, "The Young People's Satellite Network." It also had a man in a suit in a bowler hat looking into the N of the word of Nickelodeon as if he were like looking into a microscope or something. So it wasn't super appealing to kids. And I'm going to show you a picture of what this looked like. Can you see? You see the logo? Isn't that weird? Like, that's not appealing for kids.
First of all, it looks creepy.
It does.
Like, it looks like a stranger danger. Secondly, it looks like what a 45-year-old or 50-year-old woman would think kids are into. Like, it very much smacks of, we're hip with the young people. This is what the young people want today. We're hip with the children. How do you do, fellow kids?
I don't think she loved the logo either. I don't know if this was the cable network's decision or influence at all, but yeah, either way, it's not great.
Well, as we record this in February of 2024, we know that if there's anyone that's just completely above reproach, it's TV and cable and film executives.
Nickelodeon first aired their flagship show, Pinwheel, all day from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., with what would later become the movie channel, airing all night. Nickelodeon's target audience was aged 2 to 17, but they also aimed to reach a broader family audience. Into the early 80s, the channel struggled quite a bit. Their most popular show was a show called You Can't Do That on Television, which was essentially a kid's version of SNL, or the 80s version of All That, which was a kid's sketch show that would air on Nickelodeon in the 90s. It was a bit weird and subversive, and it didn't save the network from losing millions of dollars and coming in dead last in the ratings in 1984.
And by the way, for people that don't know, like having 2 or 3 channels share like a single channel on cable, like at different hours during the day, was very much a thing. Like, it was not unheard of to have like Nick from like 7 to 10 and then have like Showtime from like 12 to 12.
The old days of cable. So executives agreed that Nickelodeon needed a revamp, and it got one. The programming lineup featured new shows, and the logo was updated to a version of the orange splat that the channel would become famous for. Executives apparently really liked using the color orange, as almost nothing else on television at the time featured that color, and it really stood out. The goal was for the channel to be bright and colorful and appeal to their audience as a kids' club that they were invited to. This new era of Nickelodeon would be known as the Orange Years. Up until this point, Nickelodeon was commercial-free, but it began partnering with advertisers in 1984. With its new image and support from advertisers, Nickelodeon started to do really well over the next year. This newfound success helped in the sale of the network to Viacom, along with its sister networks MTV and VH1 for $600 million. What a price tag.
I mean, for a while that was the steal of steals.
I mean, honestly though, yeah, for those 3 channels, maybe that is the deal.
Think about how much money. Could you imagine the 90s without Nickelodeon or MTV? I mean, VH1 is later on. You know, VH1 doesn't really come in until like the 2000s.
Speaking of that, do you remember Pop-Up Video on VH1?
That was really kind of the first thing with VH1. That and Behind the Music. You can go down a whole rabbit hole of music television and music videos in like the 90s, because there was VH1, there was MTV, there was The Box, The Box was like a syndicated one that you would like call in and vote on what the next video was going to be.
I don't remember that one.
Oh yeah, it was like a whole. It would like be on different channels in different cities, but it was like, I think it was like viewer submitted, and basically like you'd have to like dial in to like a 1-800 or 1-900 number and vote on what the next song was going to be. But yeah, The Box. I mean, VH1 now is, it's all the reality shows, and it's Drag Race, and it's Cheaters reruns.
What an awful show.
You mean you don't like people in togas saying she's just a friend?
No. As you can imagine, MTV was the real prize in that deal. After being acquired by Viacom, Nickelodeon continued its success in the US, and the network's shows became a huge hit in Canada and the UK as well. Also in 1985, Nickelodeon launched what would become something iconic in its own right, and something that I personally loved, Nickelodeon began running a programming block called Nick at Night from 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. and featured a lot of popular shows from decades prior, including I Love Lucy, Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie, Leave It to Beaver, Donna Reed, Mr. Ed, Lassie, Dragnet, The Bob Newhart Show, and The Mary Tyler Moore Show.
I remember the Bob Newhart Show.
Did you watch Nick at Night?
Oh yeah, I remember when they got the Wonder Years. That's where I first saw the Wonder Years. It wasn't on when it aired on ABC. It was when it aired on Nick at Night, and that's how I ended up watching the entire series. But I remember, I think they had both Newhart shows.
They did.
They had the original one, and then the other show, which I think was just Newhart. And then I know they had Mary Tyler Moore. Now it's very jarring because now they have Friends. That's considered oldies.
Now, Nick at Night, to me, it was such a big part of my childhood. Like, I was too young to understand, like, a lot of the jokes and the context at the time, but, like, there was just something about, like, watching more adult shows, I guess, you know? And what I would do, for our listeners, I'm very much a night owl. Like, I stay up very late at night. I am not a morning person. And even back when I was a kid, I used to, like, after everybody went to bed, and this is before I had a TV in my room, I would sneak downstairs and watch TV and put on Nick at Night and just watch all the old shows. And I absolutely loved it.
Taxi. They had
Taxi. Yep. That was another one. Yeah.
In fact, they had Taxi, like mid to late 90s, they had Taxi. And I was the same way. I was a night owl. If it was a day that I did not have to get up, I would be up until like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, easily.
I just absolutely love these shows. And I'm not sure if I would have been exposed to these shows otherwise if they weren't on Nick at Night, but I really got into them, and I love them so much.
Well, and the wild part about it is too, is you go back and you watch, and we'll get into the Nick cartoons, but you go back and watch some of the cartoons and some of the jokes that they write.
We're going to get there. Later, Nick at Night would air more modern shows like The Cosby Show, Home Improvement, Roseanne, Cheers, and Full House, and like you mentioned, now Friends. In 1986, the family game show Double Dare debuted on Nickelodeon. Do you remember that show?
I don't think I remember the original. I remember Family Double Dare. There was because there was the original Double Dare, and then there was like Family Double Dare. That one I remember.
I really liked that show, but in hindsight, because I watched a lot of clips of these shows as I was doing my research, and I think I realized that Double Dare made me very much aware of, one, my anxiety, because there was a lot of like timed challenges. And it also kind of made me aware of, I don't want to say I'm OCD, but it was very messy. And I remember thinking even as a kid, like, oh, that's going to be a big mess to clean up. Who has to clean that up?
See, it made me claustrophobic. Because remember the one where you have to like climb through the nose? Because you like with all the challenges, you had to always get the little banner or flag. And I was always like, oh my God, what if I get stuck? What if I get stuck in there?
Or they had this really like nicely put together like pie of you know what I mean? And they would like jump into it and they would get all messy. And I'm like, oh no.
See, that didn't bother me as much as just like, I did not like getting trapped in something.
So for those that haven't seen Double Dare, it's essentially two families of 4 that would compete against each other by answering questions for points. Some questions led to physical challenges where one family would compete in these like quick games to achieve a certain objective, like get so many, ring tosses on something, you know what I mean? The winning family would go on to the obstacle course at the end. That's where we were talking about like, pulling the flag out of the nose or jumping into this like big pie. And yeah. Double Dare was the first show on Nickelodeon to feature the famous green slime, or GAC as it was called. Now, GAC is also a term for heroin, and it was rumored that the producers knew this and did this on purpose as a joke. Producers at the time said that they didn't know about the reference, but Mark Summers, the host of Double Dare, says that yes, they did know and it was intentional. Another Nickelodeon hit from the 80s was Mr. Wizard's World, who was essentially the original Bill Nye the Science Guy. And Mr. Wizard was older and a bit more boring, but some of the science experiments on the show were really cool, and it did get kids interested in science. Nickelodeon would also introduce another programming block from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. that was targeted for preschool age audiences, and they called it Nick Jr. It was wildly popular with kids and would eventually spin off into its own channel. In the early years, Nick Jr. would feature shows like David the Gnome, Elephant Show, Today's Special, and The Busy World of Richard Scarry. Later, Nick Jr. was home to shows like Gullah Gullah Island and Blue's Clues. Now, I remember Nick Jr. for that blue and orange combination logo. Like the orange was Nick and the blue was
the
Jr.
elephant, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It had different iterations of it, but yes, an elephant was one of them. You're 3 years younger than me, so you might have missed this trend, but like I was very much into the Elephant Show and the Busy World of Richard Scarry, which was essentially he was like it was more of an animated series, and it featured like this big worm looking guy, and I remember being really little and just loved those shows.
I think I was more Sesame Street. We were classy. We watched PBS.
Oh, good Lord.
No, but like honestly, like I remember Sesame Street. I remember watching a lot of when I was older, Carmen Sandiego and Wishbone.
I loved Carmen Sandiego. I loved the music. I loved the aesthetics of it. Like that was one of my shows, yeah. After several years of increasing success, Nickelodeon executives would make a deal that would launch the network to a new level for a while. In 1988, Nickelodeon contracted with Universal Studios Florida to build a production studio and theme park on the lot. At the time, Nickelodeon was also in talks with Disney MGM Studios to build a studio as well. Universal offered them a sweetheart deal, though. The construction of the studio would be at no cost to Nickelodeon, and they would occupy the lot rent-free. In return, Nickelodeon had to promote Universal Studios 1,000 times per year on their shows and broadcast commercials for the park as well. For Nickelodeon executives, this seemed like a no-brainer. Construction was finished in 1989, and the network held a televised live event for the grand opening, featuring all the favorite Nickelodeon hosts. Double Dare was the first show to be filmed at Universal Studios. And fun fact for everybody, prior to this, Double Dare was filmed at WHYY TV Studios in Philadelphia. The studio would go on to film most of the game shows and live action shows that Nickelodeon produced, and was also open to the public for tours during the week. Daily auditions were held at the park for studio audience members and contestants to help fill the seats in the studio. It cost the network $100 million per year to run the studio, and they went through 1,000 gallons of slime per day. That's a lot of slime.
That's a shitload of slime.
In 1992, a time capsule was buried on the studio lot, not to be opened until 2042. Now, I don't know about you, but I very vividly remember how Nickelodeon promoted Universal Studios, like at the beginning or the end of their shows, and they would show footage from outside of it with the big logo. And I remember that like giant fountain of slime, coming out of it. Do you remember?
And then the globe, like it would be like the cartoon version of it, like the drawing, and it'd be like this was made at Universal Studios, and that was huge for Universal at that kind of put them on the map. Do you have to remember, by this point, late 80s, early 90s, Universal is there, but there's a competing park about 4 or 5 miles down I-4 that is a behemoth at this point. All I can tell you is there was a time where you used to not be able to see Universal from the highway.
But like, what a deal, though, between Universal and Nickelodeon. Like, it was such a win-win for both of them,
The 90s were a hell of a time.
So we're going to come back to the Nickelodeon Universal Studios lot a little bit later, but now I want to talk about the peak era of the network, which was the 90s. Nickelodeon entered the decade with good momentum, And executives created multiple categories of shows that would really propel the network into the stratosphere. The programming moved away from teaching and wanted to focus more on kids' entertainment, a decision that would pay off big time. In the late 80s into the early 90s, many of the Nickelodeon popular shows featured either puppets or cartoons. Eureka's Castle was one of those puppet shows that kids adored, including myself. I loved them for whatever reason. I remember I watched that a lot too.
That was a little early for me. I don't remember that one.
Nickelodeon was about to get really ambitious with their programming. There were essentially 3 categories of shows that Nickelodeon focused on. The first category of shows that really ramped up in the 90s were the innovative cartoons, shows and characters that were like nothing ever seen before on television. The first 3 of these cartoons were Doug, Rugrats, and Ren and Stimpy, a trio that would be debuted as Nicktoons in 1991. Doug and Rugrats featured kids that were more relatable to audiences, and Ren and Stimpy was a bit more subversive and more of a funny cartoon.
And we're talking about original Doug, not bastardized Disney Doug, which was an abomination unto the Lord.
Nickelodeon show writers did something quite ingenious at the time and made the cartoons palatable for adults to watch as well. There were quite a bit of adult jokes and innuendos that went over kids' heads, but it also got the parents watching with them. So it was like less of a chance that the parents would come in and just change the channel. You know what I mean? Later, Nicktoons would see shows like Rocko's Modern Life, Ah, Real Monsters, Hey Arnold, Kablam, Angry Beavers, and Cat Dog.
There aren't a lot of kids' cartoon shows where the main character is working at a phone sex line. And that was a Rocko's Modern Life episode.
Like I said, watching some of these clips back, like it was very adult and a lot of adult, particularly Rocko's Modern Life. They said that it was pretty inappropriate. Now, the jokes and references may have gone over the kids' heads, but like it's still not great for shows that were mainly targeted for kid audiences. And like I said, rewatching some of these clips, like they definitely had a point. But like you said, it was the 90s. Nicktoons became so popular that it would eventually branch out into merchandise with toys, books, clothes, home videos, and then, of course, the infamous GAC was added as well. Glow-in-the-dark GAC.
That I remember.
Did you ever have GAC?
I did not, but I remember it.
I remember it too. I don't think my mom let me have it because I remember friends having it and it was a very gross consistency and it smelled weird.
I'd imagine it's like a liquid or like silly putty.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. In total, Nicktoons would have 42 different shows that aired on Nickelodeon. The next category of shows that Nickelodeon ramped up in the 90s were live-action game shows. Double Dare was the network's first game show, and kind of like we mentioned, it would have multiple iterations in the years to come, though it was said to take a very long time to film. In addition, shows like Guts, Wild and Crazy Kids, Figure It Out, and Legends of the Hidden Temple would become a regular part of the lineup as well. Now, I know that we mentioned these shows in our Game Show Scandals episodes, and I loved all of these. And I kind of forgot about Wild and Crazy Kids, but like that was another one. I fully believe, and I'm still pretty confident that I could have gone on these shows and did well.
Wild and Crazy Kid, one of like a billion shows in the 90s that had Omar Gooding in it. Like he was in Smart Guy, he was in Hanging with Mr. Cooper, he was one of like the counselors in like Wild and Crazy Kids. Although that really wasn't like a game show as much as it was like an activity show.
Yeah, but it got roped in with that category. Yeah.
Oh my! I wanted to be on Guts.
Yeah, I think I would. I think I could have won. I very much wanted to run up the crag. I wanted and like have the fog shooting in your face and like the sparkles and shit. Like I wanted to be
also
on
like
Guts.
12-year-old me had such a crush on Summer Sanders.
Yeah, she was cute. Yeah, I know that you are also very much a fan of Legends of the Hidden Temple, and I'm gonna break your heart a little bit. A couple of fucked up facts about Legends of the Hidden Temple. So first, you won't be surprised to know that the temple guards literally scared and traumatized kids on the show. Like, they were legit scared of their interactions with them. And two, the show itself was rigged. Host Kirk Fogg admitted years later that the show only had 8 championship prizes to hand out per year, and then they played the games accordingly. So it was fixed. It wasn't even real.
So basically, they always did it to fuck over the Silver Snakes.
Other shows were added to the lineup, like Nick Arcade, which was also another one of my favorite ones. And that was a show that focused on video game challenges and involved the main character, Mikey, a cartoon character who contestants moved around this game board to, get to the end. There was also Get the Picture, where kids had to answer questions and guess a picture from these series of dotted lines. And then there was What Would You Do? With who can finish first contests and these stunts performed by contestants that were reading notes from index cards that were taped on audience members' heads, very Michael Scott style in Diversity Day. And I guess it wasn't as offensive, certainly. They also featured the infamous Pie Pod, which I don't know if you remember that. You had to sit in this chair and they would throw pies at you, and to me, it kind of looked like a medieval torture device, but yeah.
I mean, the whole point of Nickelodeon was chaos.
And messiness.
And getting actors and kid actors who were willing to do that. Danny Tamborelli was basically on every... He was the Daryl Hammond of Nick game shows. He was on every single one.
He was on a lot of them, yeah. The success of these game shows led to a spin-off channel called Nick Gas, or Games and Sports, which debuted in 1999. And I loved that too. I remember it was 2005, 2006. I was in my early 20s, and it would play late at night, and it just brought back a lot of memories. It was very nostalgic. It had a lot of these shows, and I loved watching it.
I went to many a college party where basically friends were basically betting money while drunk watching Guts. So imagine just a bunch of 20-year-olds drunk off their ass watching Guts or Legends of the Hidden Temple.
The third category of shows that found success in the 90s was live action scripted shows, and these were for preteen and teenage audiences. Shows like Salute Your Shorts, Hey Dude, Welcome Freshman, The Adventures of Pete and Pete, and The Secret World of Alex Mack would all earn decent ratings for the network. Nickelodeon also debuted sketch shows that were an evolution of their very first one in the 80s, You Can't Do That on Television. All That, Kenan and Kel, and The Amanda Show felt very much like shows for kids by kids, and the audiences loved them.
I mean, All That is iconic.
Very iconic.
Think of the careers it launched. I can remember whether it was Repairman or Good Burger or Everyday French with Pierre Escargot, and I used to watch Kenan and Kel all the time. That's what made, if you've ever seen the SNL sketch from, I think it was from last year, with Kenan and Keke Palmer, where they do Kenan and Kelly, and they bring back Kel. It is, it hit so well because at least half of the people who were sitting in that live audience probably watched Kenan and Kel and could probably recite the Coolio theme song line for line.
In 1992, Nickelodeon debuted another teen-friendly programming block called Snick on Saturday nights from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. The show lineup included Are You Afraid of the Dark?, Clarissa Explains It All, Ren and Stimpy, and Roundhouse, which was kind of like another version of kids' SNL. So I loved Are You Afraid of the Dark? And I know we mentioned in the game show Scandal episodes, it was a bit too scary for kids, at least the age that I was when I watched them. It scared the shit out of me. But yeah, it was a lot.
I never watched Are You Afraid of the Dark, but I did watch Pete and Pete. Mm-hmm. I did watch Clarissa, and I did watch All That.
It was definitely a smart move by Nickelodeon because you had like the TGIF on ABC on Fridays, and this kind of supplemented that with Saturday night shows for kids. So it was
Well,
very
and it
smart.
was the whole branding with the orange couch. If you ever have a chance, so I think Melissa Joan Hart, she just did a while ago, she did the Boy Meets World rewatch podcast, and she was talking about like what it took to make Clarissa. And Clarissa was really one of like the first single camera shows. Like before single camera like sitcoms were a thing, like Clarissa was it was Clarissa was one of the first.
It's funny you say that because I recently saw an interview with her. I think it was on Maya and Bialik's podcast, which is wonderful. She interviews a lot of now adult kid actors and just talks a lot about mental health stuff. So go check that out. I usually watch her on YouTube. But she had Melissa Joan Hart on, and she basically said how difficult it could be to film Clarissa because like she had just pages and pages of dialogue and had to memorize that and had to get through it. And being, very much a young person herself at the time, like it wasn't an easy thing to do. By 1994, Nickelodeon was starting to face competition from the Disney Channel and Cartoon Network, as we mentioned earlier, but they would continue to see high ratings for the rest of the decade as the brand kept growing. Also around this time, Nickelodeon launched Nick in the Afternoon in the summertime with host Stick Stickly, which was literally a popsicle stick with eyeballs for another programming block of popular shows for kids to watch on summer break. The Kids' Choice Awards also kicked off its first annual ceremonies, with actors, shows, and video games winning awards as voted on by kids. Nickelodeon also launched its own website, Nick Online, in 1995, and released their first in a series of movies based on their network shows a year later. Harriet the Spy, Good Burger, and the Rugrats movie would become their most popular ones.
Harriet the Spy, that was one of my favorites.
They did try to provide some educational programming. By 1999, Nickelodeon partnered with Sesame Workshop to create Noggin, an educational channel with an interactive website. Also in 1999, Nickelodeon created the show that would become their biggest cash cow yet and would carry the network for the next 2 decades. Can you guess what show that is?
Does he live in a pineapple under the sea?
He absolutely does. It is SpongeBob SquarePants. Now, the idea for SpongeBob originally started as Sponge Boy Ahoy, but Sponge Boy was already licensed, so they went with SpongeBob, and they literally hit corporate pay dirt. The show was wildly popular with a wide range of audiences, including teens and college kids. I remember this guy I was friends with, I think it was my freshman year in college, and he absolutely loved SpongeBob. I mean, he had SpongeBob pajama pants and shirts, and he had a little stuffed animal in his like he was nuts about SpongeBob.
SpongeBob still resonates, if by no other reason that Nick just did a simulcast of the Super Bowl where they had SpongeBob and Patrick live action on television. That's incredible.
The SpongeBob themed merchandise alone raked in millions of dollars. It has multiple films and still produces new episodes on Nickelodeon today. A lot of the Nickelodeon shows were short-lived series, only lasting a few years before being canceled and replaced. SpongeBob is certainly an outlier. As the turn of the century approached, Nickelodeon partnered with McDonald's to kick off the new era with the Nickelodeon, which was a 2-day futuristic-themed programming block of episodes from the network's most popular shows.
Did they also involve in the Monopoly scandal?
They did not, no. And it was, around this time right before this that, the whole thing blew up and they got caught.
They're carrying away SpongeBob in handcuffs. Head count to wire fraud.
Later that year, in October of 2000, Nickelodeon released a movie that was interesting to say the least. The movie was a horror movie called Crybaby Lane, and it was about conjoined twins who got sick and died, and their father cut them in half before burying them in a cemetery. After hearing the story, two boys go to the cemetery to summon their ghosts, and one of the boys becomes possessed by the twins. As you can imagine, parents were outraged. It only aired in the US and was promptly pulled from the network and hidden for the next decade. Nickelodeon would bounce back from the disaster that was Crybaby Lane and release the first ever CGI movie, Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius, in 2001. The network also expanded to 4 different channels: the flagship Nickelodeon, Noggin, Nick Gas, and Nicktoons TV. By this point, they had enough cartoon shows to air animated content 24/7. They also partnered with THQ Games to release a series of Nickelodeon video games based on their shows. One person that was interviewed for a documentary that I watched about Nickelodeon said of the channel, "They got bigger and they got more corporate and more out of control." At this point, it was the beginning of their downfall. By 2004, the Nickelodeon lot at Universal Studios Florida tried to revamp its look with a fresh coat of paint, and the network's logo was updated to be more modern. It wasn't as well received as the old one was. Nickelodeon also launched Worldwide Day of Play, in which the network would not air any shows in order to motivate kids to get outside and get moving. Now, this did backfire a bit, though, as most kids would just change the channel and watch Cartoon Network instead. A new era of teen shows would also debut, including Drake and Josh, Zoe 101, iCarly, and Victorious, where Ariana Grande, Jamie Lynn Spears, Jeanette McCurdy, and others would first make a name for themselves. Nickelodeon wasn't quite the same, though. While somewhat popular, some thought these new teen shows were dry and the dialogues and storylines were boring or unrealistic. The network struggled with new content that kept audiences coming back. SpongeBob would continue to be their only massive hit. In 2005, Nickelodeon's Universal Studios lot was struggling for 2 main reasons. One, the daily tours that were given were very disruptive to the crews filming their TV shows, as tourgoers would walk through the building and essentially watch them like zoo animals. Actors on the shows that were filmed there also predominantly lived in California and had to fly back and forth from Florida to film their shows, and they weren't happy about it. Productions were eventually moved to LA, and there wasn't much left in Florida to support the studio lot, so it closed later that year. Not to worry, though. While the Universal Studios lot closed, Nickelodeon Family Suites by Holiday Inn opened in 2005. And this was affectionately known as the Nickelodeon Hotel. And this was also based in Orlando, Florida. It had a lot of amenities and activities for kids, but it often felt overstimulating, claustrophobic, and isolating for guests. People complained that the hotel was not well maintained and that the food was bad. They also could not compete with Disney World. After changing names a few times, the hotel filed for bankruptcy and closed in 2016. It's still open today as just a Holiday Inn.
So I mentioned before that the Nick deal was really beneficial for Universal at a time where they were really trying to put themselves on the map. And they did. By the time that Universal deal wraps up, and by the time they close Nick Studios, Universal's expanded rapidly. Universal didn't have a hotel on the property when the Nick deal happened. They now have, I think, 3. Universal only had the one studio park. They now have the second park that also has the Harry Potter world. You couldn't see Universal from I-4. Now you can. It did help them a lot. The problem is, though, is who was 5 miles down the road. It is very hard to compete with them when they have just more of everything than you do, including money, including resources, including properties. Now, Universal is pretty listen, it's not great that like 5 companies pretty much own every media property in the world. Universal does more than okay for themselves. I liken it to what happened with Nickelodeon and their kind of market share is kind of akin to a team that is really good for a long time. When there's a sports team that's doing really well, there's usually a lot of reasons for it. They're getting good players, they're identifying good players. That usually means you have a lot of people in the front office who can identify talent, who can develop talent. You've probably found a way to find market inefficiencies and find players that other teams may not value as highly, but can fit. But what happens after a while is when you're successful, when you've constantly kind of exploited those loopholes, is that your competitors are eventually going to find those loopholes themselves. All of a sudden, you don't have the advantages like you did before. Through really the mid 90s, Disney Channel isn't really a player. They're almost more syndication. Like they're doing like the Mickey Mouse Club and things like that, but they're also airing like all the Disney animated movies. They're airing like feature films. They're not really producing original content. That changes in the mid to late 90s when Disney Channel starts doing the original movies. And they also get into like the syndication game. They start airing like Sister Sister and Smart Guy, and then they pick up Boy Meets World. I think they were actually like the first national channel to air Boy Meets World when Boy Meets World became eligible for syndication. By the early 2000s, they're doing Even Stevens, and they're doing Kim Possible. They're doing The Proud Family and things like that. Now you're starting to see them encroach into Nickelodeon's space. And by this point in the early 2000s, Disney's still the big bully. They're still the big boys. Disney starts to throw their weight around, quite literally.
So the next thing to go was the channel Nick Gas in 2007. It aired in programming blocks on another channel for about another year and a half until 2009. The channel had declined in ratings because it literally had just become a dumping ground for old game shows. It had so much potential, but it never really capitalized on the live sports aspect that it had been initially intended for. The focus and intention on the channel just wasn't there, and it inevitably had to come to an end. Nickelodeon did try to catch up with the internet and started selling show DVDs on Amazon and began creating more online content. They launched Nickelodeon Magazine and also partnered with DreamWorks to make some of their movies into shows. They again attempted to revamp their image with yet another logo, but none of it really helped. Audiences didn't care about any other shows other than SpongeBob. Nickelodeon also passed on the hit show Adventure Time, which would later air on Cartoon Network and become a really mega hit for them. I do think at this point, Gen X and millennials had really aged out of Nickelodeon shows, and they gravitated more towards Cartoon Network for the adult humor and more of that subversive vibe, and also the internet was a thing. I really think Nickelodeon couldn't keep up with the changing times and the changing trends, and I don't necessarily know how much they actually tried to at the same time.
Like a lot of media companies of the 90s, I think they were victims of their own success. Instead of maybe constantly trying to look at what they could do better and how they can improve, they were just so fixated on trying to milk every cent out of what had been so successful for them the year before. And that's when the good teams, the good networks will reinvent themselves. And Nick, for a long time, never really did. Disney reinvented themselves, and they put a lot of time and effort and energy into kind of capturing the tween and the teen market. And that's when they come up with Hannah Montana, and that's when they come up with Wizards of Waverly Place, and that's when they come up with That's So Raven. And they kind of stole a lot of the market share. And yeah, they're Disney, and they were going to figure it out eventually. And this is really kind of endemic of so many media companies in the late 2000s. By the time they realize something's wrong, it's already too late. We talked about now how Nick at Night has Friends and How I Met Your Mother. I think they have that too at this point. You can go on any streaming service and find that. You can basically turn on TBS, and odds are you're going to be seeing a Friends or a Big Bang Theory rerun. I think what Nick did figure out in the later years, at least the last couple of years, is realizing that they have a pretty significant media arm at their disposal as well. One of, quite frankly, the most genius things Nick came up with was, hey, we're part of Viacom. Viacom has CBS. And what is CBS's most valuable property at this point? The NFL. And so what does Nick do? Nick creates what 10-year-old me would have absolutely loved, which is a kid-centric simulcast of an NFL game. They have been phenomenal. And I implore you, if you're interested in it, to go read any of the pieces on The Athletic or anywhere about the just massive undertaking that it does to do all the graphics and all the different camera angles and all the special little things that they do for that broadcast. And also that they've put a lot of really talented people in terms of producers and directors and graphics people and, getting announcers that can do a very great job of both understanding why they're there and also explaining what the hell's going on. There are a lot of people who, when the Nick simulcast is on, are watching that because they don't want to hear Tony Romo or they don't want to hear Jim Nantz creepily go, "Hello, friends." Again, it's about doing things that no one else is doing. And Nick fell victim to a lot of the same overexposure, a lot of the same greed that a lot of other media companies fell victim to in the 2000s.
It seemed like they didn't want to put in the effort to try to keep up, and they paid the price for it.
Nick stopped innovating. They just kept resting on what they'd been doing because it was making so much money for them before. Well, like, you could have invested in adult cartoons. Were you going to be able to compete with, what Adult Swim was putting out there? Probably not, but you could have at least tried.
Yeah, there was nothing like that they even made an effort at. And I honestly think, and one of the documentaries that I watched mentioned this, they relied way too much on SpongeBob. Like, they put a lot of their eggs in that basket, and it's still on today, as I mentioned, but I think for the depth and maybe the reach of the network, like, there was nothing else there.
By that point, you're kind of stuck because you can't kill the golden goose, as it were, or I guess in this case, the golden sponge. It reminded me when we were doing the Enron episode and we were watching the documentary, they had one of the old traders say, well, they couldn't kill this part of the company because it was the only part of it that was making money. They couldn't cut off their nose to spite their face.
So, as we mentioned, Nickelodeon never really recovered from here. In the 2010s, the network was airing old shows as, I'm assuming, an attempt to lure back grown-up audiences with nostalgia. They were also a little late to the streaming game, but Nickelodeon shows are now available on Pluto, Disney Plus, and Paramount. I don't think it's an accident that Nickelodeon peaked in the 90s. It really felt like it was built for the 90s. It fit into pop culture seamlessly and provided entertainment for kids before the internet and social media era. Though they're trying to keep it alive, Nickelodeon will never be the same as it once was. Now, of course, Nickelodeon has a bit of a darker side to it that I want to briefly talk about. For a network that was for kids and about kids that also employed kids, they didn't treat them very well. There were 12-hour workdays, low pay, and no royalties in the early years. There were castmate feuds, overbearing parents, hostile work environments, discrimination, and abuse. Many of the child and teen stars had difficulties in their personal lives after becoming famous, after being on Nickelodeon. Drake Bell from Drake and Josh was arrested and charged with a DUI in 2015, and Matthew Underwood from Zoe 101 got arrested for possession and supplying a minor with drugs. Amanda Bynes from The Amanda Show and All That had a very public mental health struggle. One animated Nickelodeon show was accused of plagiarism in 2019 by the creators of a short film called Hair Love. Jamie Lynn Spears got pregnant at 16 while she was on Zoe 101, and after a lot of general criticism from the public, the network parted ways with her. The creator of Ren and Stimpy would get in confrontations with crew members, often miss deadlines, and created a hostile work environment and poor show content. 2 people working on the production accused him of harassment and inappropriate behavior. Jeanette McCurdy, who was on multiple Nickelodeon teen shows, including Zoe 101, Victorious, iCarly, and Sam and Cat, has spoken very publicly about her time at Nickelodeon. She talks about how she feels ashamed of the shows that she was in, calling them cheesy and embarrassing. It is also well known how abusive her mother was, and she says that Nickelodeon was aware of it but did nothing. There were also 3 men that we know of who took advantage of their roles within the Nickelodeon network to hurt children. Brian Peck was an actor who was convicted in 2004 of lewd acts with a Nickelodeon child actor. Also in 2004, production assistant Jason Handy was convicted of possession of CSAM and sexual abuse of a minor. After serving his sentence, he returned to work for Nickelodeon not long after his release from prison. That really got me. The network was well aware of what he did and that he was in prison for this. And when he gets, let's just give you a job again. Let's just hire you back. You were employee of the year. So yeah, it's just so gross. You're supposed to protect kids. You're supposed to be for kids. And this is what you're doing behind the scenes.
It's gross. And it's funny too, like, 'cause I mentioned, did you watch Boy Meets World or no?
Oh yeah, I love that show. Yeah.
So I don't know if you've been listening to the podcast that Topanga and Sean and Eric do, where they basically rewatch all the episodes. Apparently, Brian Peck was in like a bunch of episodes as a walk-on as starting in season 5. They basically just had an episode this week that was like, well, he's in them and we're gonna have to address it. And he basically like groomed Sean and Eric. We're gonna have to bring it up.
And finally, the most egregious one of them all is a man named Dan Schneider, who was a creator of numerous shows for Nickelodeon, including The Amanda Show, Drake and Josh, and Zoe 101, just to name a few. Not only did he have a bad temper and was reportedly difficult to work with, there are rampant rumors about his foot fetish and alleged inappropriate behavior and abuse. The Nickelodeon shows that Dan was involved in had numerous mentions and shots of feet and foot-related jokes, to the point where if you look back at some of these clips, they seem a bit sexualized, which is, again, for kids programming, super gross.
Beyond gross.
I think there's a distinction, though, between the adult jokes that were in the Nicktoons back in the 90s and these blatantly fetishized scenes that were kind of like a fever dream for this one creator. You know what I mean? It's 2 very different things.
I mean, it's extremely different. There are ways to write adult jokes for kind of kids shows or teen shows or tween shows and have it just be a really good joke, a really clever joke, or just be a smart joke. You look back on some of it now and it's just, you almost kind of feel like, how could you miss it?
Nickelodeon also had their logo as an orange foot at one point. I don't know if you remember this.
All the promos, yeah.
I'm not sure if Dan was a part of that or not. Now, Jeanette McCurdy and others have come forward about his behavior, including encouraging them to drink underage, receiving private massages, and engaging in other inappropriate touching. Jeanette writes in her book that Nickelodeon offered her money to keep quiet about it, which she declined. Nickelodeon cut ties with Dan in 2018, not over the allegations, but because his quote-unquote contract ended. Dan has never been charged with any crimes. Now, like we were saying, it doesn't seem like anyone was protecting these kids, and especially in Dan's situation, the success of the shows that he produced were clearly more important than kids that were speaking out against him. And there's actually a documentary coming out about him in March, and I think it's going to be on Hulu, I want to say, where others are going to share their stories and experiences with Dan. So if you're interested in that, like I said, that's coming out sometime in mid-March.
And if you haven't had a chance to read Jeanette's book, it's very good, while also being incredibly heartbreaking.
I think what bothers me the most about this story of Nickelodeon is that the network really failed because the culture had changed, not necessarily because of the scandals or abuses, which absolutely should have been taken more seriously. And I didn't know a lot about this before I went into this, and it just has really changed my view of the network. And I don't know. It's not the same. It's not the same as what I remember in the 90s. And I'm sure some of this was going on back then, but this is just to kind of see the trajectory of it. It's really disappointing. Another thing that kind of hit me as I was running through the timeline is I think it just got too big with, Universal Studios and the hotel and the website and all these different shows and all these different channels. Like, I think if they would have stayed, kind of like what you mentioned before, if they would have stayed more focused on what was successful and kind of honed in on that and capitalized on that, I think the outcome may have been a little bit different.
I mean, yeah, they expanded incredibly fast. And like with a lot of things you see when you have multinational corporations involved in this, they try to basically just milk every cent out of it.
Would you agree that what I was saying earlier, that it feels like peak Nickelodeon was built for the 90s, and when the 90s ended and the culture changed, all that changed with it?
They capitalized on a moment in time, and there was one or two ways they could have gone. They could have continued to try and innovate, or they could have continued to double and triple down. They doubled and tripled down in a bad way, and the world changed around them. They could not or would not adapt. And by the time they did adapt, they've done some nice things. It's just way too late now.
I think it really came down to greed of executives and SpongeBob.
Fucking SpongeBob. Also, too, I think there was very much a culture of we're going to kind of look past things in order to keep the train rolling. Those people who made those decisions to keep very bad people employed and in power, those are decisions that they're going to have to live with. A lot of innocent people paid the price as a result.
So tell us what you guys think. Did this bring back a lot of memories for you guys? Were you big Nickelodeon kids? Do you remember the shows we talked about? And what do you think about some of these scandals? Like, do you think it was corporate greed, cover up? They couldn't keep up with the changing times. We want to hear from you guys about it.
Hit us up on our socials, on TikTok, on Instagram, at the Tell Me About Podcast at gmail.com. And we cannot wait to talk with you again next week.
All right. So we will be back next week with another episode from Tom. As he mentioned, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. Follow us on our socials. And we will see you next week, everybody.
Have a great week.